Our story continues with Book 2, Diablo, the Sinwar Trilogy, Scales of the Serpent. Authored by Richard A. Knaak. A property of Blizzard Entertainment and published by Pocket Books, a division of Simon & Schuster. Prologue.
The world was forever changed by the second coming of the Nephilim. But changed most of all was the first among their kind, Odyssean old Diomed. Wanting nothing more than the simple, worthy life of a farmer, he was now forced to become a catalyst for upheaval. Through him would be revealed some of the truth concerning Sanctuary, as the world was called by those who most vied to control it. Through him did others learn of the eternal war between angels and demons, through the guises of the Cathedral of Light and the Temple of the Triune. And knowing Odyssean as a threat to all they planned, both the cathedral and the temple, in their own ways, worked to either beguile him into becoming their puppet or destroy him utterly. Worse, betrayed by what he had thought love, Odyssean became a danger to himself, for he risked becoming blind to what was happening around him, even as he sought to free humans from the yoke of those believing themselves the race's rightful masters. But although Odyssean felt that the entire fate of Sanctuary rested on his weary shoulders, he could not know that there had been others fighting for centuries against his same enemies, fighting them despite what had seemed for centuries the hopelessness of their cause. He could not know this, which was probably for the best, for they, in turn, were not certain if he should be welcomed or destroyed, just as the angels and demons believed. From the books of Kalan, 5th tome, 1st leaf.
Chapter 1. The city of Taraja burned. While never able to approach in magnitude or glory Great Khajan to the east, Taraja had still been known far and wide for its unique sights, catering to the pilgrim and the inhabitant alike. There was the vast, open market just beyond its northwestern gate, where anything from the known lands could be bought or sold for the right price. Near the city center lay the centuries-old, intricately sculpted gardens, where one could admire the spiral trees or the fallow blooms, the fabled flowers with more than a dozen variations of bright colors on each petal and a scent that perfumers could never match. Beyond that stood the towering arena of Klytos, home of the Nerolian Games, attracting visitors from even the sprawling capital. But all those legendary sights, often filled to capacity, were empty this one terrible eve. Indeed, there was only activity in a lone part of the city, and the hint of that could be witnessed from as far as a mile away in the deep jungle surrounding walled Taraja. Taraja burned, and at the center of the conflagration lay the Temple of the Triune. The flames illuminated the sky well above the three-towered, triangular structure, the largest temple of the sect other than the main one near Khajan. Black smoke billowed from the foremost tower, the one dedicated to Mephis, one of the three guiding spirits. The huge red circle, representing both the order and love, Mephis's supposed sphere of influence, hung lopsided. Cast of iron, the immense circle now threatened those below as the damage from the fire ate away at its remaining supports. The original constructors had never imagined that such a fate would ever befall the structure, and so had not added additional support. If calamity imminently threatened the Tower of Mephis, it had already claimed that of Dylon to the right. The proud ram's head, symbol of determination, still hung high, but above it the structure was a collapsed ruin. Oddly, little of the upper level had actually fallen to the streets below. Most of the stone and wood rubble lay piled atop, as if the tower had somehow imploded. Hundreds of figures swarmed the area around the steps, those nearest the entrance clad in the azure, gold, or black robes of the three orders. With them stood scores of hooded, breastplated figures, the temple's peace warders, armed with swords and lances. The faithful of the Triune fought against a crush of bodies whose foremost ranks were dressed in simple peasant and farmer clothing of the upper lands far to the northwest of the great jungles. The pale skin and tighter garments of the first figures was in sharp contrast not only to the mainly swarthy servants of the temple, but also those making up most of the successive waves behind the lead attackers. Indeed, the bulk of the movement against the Triune consisted of natives of Toraja itself, marked by their loose-fitting, flowing, red and purple garments and long, black hair bound to the back. Although it was the attackers who wielded the majority of the torches, the flames consuming much of the nearby sections of the city were not, for the most part, their doing. In fact, no one could for certain say how the first fires had begun, only that they seemed to initially work in favor of the priesthood, and that had been enough to turn what sympathies there had been for the Triune into anger. That anger was all the impetus needed to urge Odyssean to take down the temple without further delay. When he had initially arrived in Toraja, and once he had gotten over his astonishment at so many people packed into one place, Odyssean had thought to gradually influence the citizenry into simply ousting the priests and their underlings from the city. But for such a heinous act, in which dozens of locals and even some of his original followers had perished, no remorse or sympathy remained in the former farmer's heart.
I came to this city, hoping to teach, to convert people.
Odyssean bitterly thought as he strode toward the steps.
But they forced this upon all of us instead.
Without seeing him, the crowd parted. Any of those touched by the power within Odyssean, the power of the Nephilim, could sense his nearness. The momentum of the crowd paused as they realized that Odyssean had something in mind. He had not been the cause of the devastation so far embracing the temple. That had been the results of the more primitive efforts by some of his enthusiastic followers, such as Romus, one of the lead Parthens. Romus was one of a handful of the most advanced among Odyssean's acolytes. Partha had been the second place to witness the miracle of Odyssean's gift, after his own village of Sarum. However, unlike Sarum, where the son of Diomedes had been cast as a murderer and a monster, the Parthens had welcomed his abilities and embraced his simple but honest beliefs. Odyssean was not the image of a crusading prophet, as fables usually went. He was no angelic, ageless youth like he who led the Cathedral of Light, the rival sect of the temple, nor the silver-haired, benevolent elder such as the Primus, whose servants now awaited Odyssean's wrath. Odyssean ul Diomed had been born to be a tiller of soil, square-jawed and with rough-hewn features half-draped by a short beard. He was strong of build due to his hard life, but otherwise unremarkable. His sandy-colored hair hung unkempt down to his neck, any attempt at neatness lost in tonight's chaos. Odyssean wore a plain brown shirt and pants and weathered boots. He carried no weapon save for a knife thrust into his belt. Indeed, he needed no weapon. He himself far deadlier than the sharpest blade or the swiftest, truest arrow, or even a squad of peace warders who at this very moment charged down the steps at him. Behind them, a priest of Dialon imperiously barked orders. Odyssean had no special hate for the fool, for he knew that the cleric simply mouthed the words of his superior, secreted somewhere deep in the temple complex. Nonetheless, both the warriors and the priest would suffer for their zealous loyalty to the foul sect. Odyssean let the guards come nearly within weapon's reach, then, without so much as a blink, sent the entire contingent flying in different directions. Some collided with the pillars at the top of the steps, their bones audibly cracking, while others flew all the way back to the bronze doors themselves, where they dropped in twisted heaps. A few went hurtling to the sides, landing with a harsh crash at the feet of the waiting throng, who broke out into cheers at the display of their leader's power. An archer next to the priest fired. He could not have made a worse decision. Odyssean frowned, the only outward hint of the terrible memories flashing through his mind. He relived again his friend Achilleos' stand before the demon Lucian, who, in the guise of the Primus, had created the Triune to corrupt and control mankind. Still as vivid as the moment it had happened was the hunter's shot, which, at the demon's desire, turned about and pierced Achilleos through the throat. Odyssean now did the same for the bolt fired at him. Without hesitation, it arced around, racing back up. The archer looked aghast, but he was not the target. The arrow drove through the chest of the priest as if passing only through air. It continued on, still accelerating until it reached the door bearing the circular symbol of Memphis. There, driven by Odyssean's will, the arrow impaled itself in the center of the circle in a perfect bullseye, burying deep into the metal. It all happened so swiftly that only now did the priest's body waver. He let out a gurgling sound of blood poured not only from the wound, but mouth as well. His expression went slack, and then the robed figure toppled forward, rolling down the steps in a macabre tangle of loose limbs. The archer dropped his weapon and fell to his knees in abject shock. He stared at Odyssean, awaiting his doom. A deathly calm pervaded the vicinity. Odyssean strode up to the guard. Beyond the one stricken warrior, the rest of the temple's defenders grimly sought to regroup. The blood of several of Odyssean's more impetuous converts decorated the area, giving proof to the peace warders' determination to let none pass alive. Jaw set, Odyssean placed a hand on the shoulder of the kneeling guard. In a voice that boomed as if thunder, the son of Diomedes said,
"Let this one be spared, as an example."
He glared at the other peace warders.
"The rest can join their Primus in hell."
His words provoked some slight confusion on the part of the armed guards, who could not know that Odyssean had slain Lucian. This was not the first time that Odyssean had noticed such reactions, and he could only assume that word had not yet reached the outer temples of the Primus's unexplained absence. The senior priesthood had evidently smothered all hint of the calamity from their own flock, but Odyssean would make certain that soon the truth would be known to the entire world. Not that it would matter to those in Taraja. After this night, the Triune would be but a cursed word to many of the locals, as, very likely, would be his own name. He eyed the guards and the priests.
"You've spilled enough of other people's blood. Now pay with as much of your own."
One of the peace warders suddenly gasped. A seam opened on his throat, and out of it poured blood. He tried to cover it with a hand, but that hand too bled profusely. Other tears spread over his body, as if invisible swords slashed him from every direction. From each gushed more blood. The men beside him started to retreat, but first one, then another, and then another suffered similar, but not identical, rips and slashes over their bodies. Blood even seeped from beneath breastplates and under helmets and hoods. The first man finally fell, a crimson pool as large as his head already staining the once pristine marble beneath him. His collapse was quickly followed by that of another, and then temple guards and priests fell in numbers. They suffered 100-fold the terrible wounds that they had inflicted upon not only Odyssean's people, but years of secret victims before them. Not one was spared among the band upon whom Odyssean had set his baleful gaze. And from positions elsewhere among the defenders, dark-hearted peace warders suddenly lost all nerve. They began to abandon the ranks, and the priests did nothing to stop them, for they too were shaken by the unworldly might of the lone, insignificant-looking figure. The crowd roared anew at what was surely a sign of absolute victory and surged forward again. The remaining peace warders were swamped, and as Odyssean had declared, they received no mercy. Odyssean continued on past the terrible struggle, more concerned with what lay within the walls. Peace warders and minor priests meant nothing. The true threat awaited him deep in the sanctum of the Master Cleric, who answered directly to the Primus, and thus knew the foul truth concerning the Triune's origins and goal. The three doors confronted Odyssean now: the Ram of Dialon, the Circle of Mephis, and the Leaf of Bala, all at eye level. The arrow he had sent flying through the priest still quivered in the middle door, the one he now chose through which to enter despite detecting that it had been barred from the inside. A retching groan erupted from the door. The entire piece shook as if about to explode. Instead, though, it finally flung back, swinging so hard that two of the hinges tore out of the stone, and the door ended up dangling lopsided. Behind him, Odyssean could sense several of his followers, all but at his heels. He could no more stop them at this point than he could have the peace warders. They were too caught up in the desire for retribution. That suddenly bothered him. Odyssean understood the reasons for their anger. When he, his brother Mendelm, their friend, Cerinthia, and the Parthens had entered Taraja little more than 2 weeks before, it had been as weary travelers, awed by the spectacle around them. Odyssean had come with the intention of peacefully revealing the gift to all those willing to partake of it. But from the very beginning, the Triune had reacted as if a nest of vipers had suddenly hatched in their midst. 2 days after the crowds began to gather around him in the marketplace, most simply to hear his tale, the Tarajian guard came to forcibly usher his followers out of the city and drag the former farmer himself to some undisclosed place of arrest. There had been no explanation given, but it had rapidly become clear that the orders had come directly from the temple. Until that moment, Odyssean had begun to believe that Taraja might turn out to be like Partha. Then again, perhaps the two were more similar than he had first thought, for had not the Triune struck at him there as well? Under the command of the High Priest of Mephis, sadistic Malik, friends had been brutally slaughtered, and Odyssean himself had nearly been marched off a helpless prisoner. A scream broke out from behind him, cutting to an abrupt end to his reverie. Odyssean whirled. 2 people lay sprawled dead on the tiled floor, and 3 others were badly wounded. Small metal stars stuck out from their throats, chests, and other parts of their bodies. The corpses were Parthens, and the loss of more of those who on their own had trailed a then reluctant Odyssean into the deep jungles especially shook him. With an angry gesture, he sent a wave of air throughout the chamber. His action came just in time, freezing a new mass of metal stars in midair, their flight apparently triggered by some mechanism in the walls. Odyssean let most of the deadly missiles clatter harmlessly to the floor, but sent a few back into the slots from which they had come in order to prevent others from launching. That done, he raced to the stricken figures. The dying were all Tarajians, and one of them was very familiar to Odyssean. Jezron Rashin had been the first local to approach the pale stranger speaking in the square, the dark-skinned youth, the only son of a nearby prominent merchant. There had been no real reason for him to so willingly listen, much less accept Odyssean's words, for Jezron had obviously wanted for nothing in his life. Yet he had listened, and listened well. When Odyssean had offered to share his gift with any Tarajian willing, it had been Jezron who had immediately stepped forward. The dying boy looked up at the looming figure. As with all Tarajians, to Odyssean, the whites of Jezron's eyes seemed much brighter and more vivid. He knew that the illusion was due to the latter's dark skin, but still found the sight arresting. Jezron managed a sickly smile. He opened his mouth, then died. Odyssean swore, knowing that the wounded youth had already been beyond even his skills. But the others might not be. Realizing this, Odyssean gently set Jezron's head down, then spun to the next victim, immediately placing his palm against the Tarajian's forehead. The man let out a gasp. With an unsettling sound, the vicious stars popped out of the wounds, which then sealed. The Tarajian grinned gratefully. Odyssean did the same for the third victim, a woman, then glanced bitterly at Chezron's corpse.
2 alive, but 1 dead. So much for my vaunted gift.
He holds no anger against you, said Mendeln from behind Odyssean, his sibling's voice utterly calm even in the midst of calamity. And now better understands the truth concerning everything than either of us. Mendeln was slighter of stature than his elder brother and had always been more studious. Although he had accepted from Odyssean the same touch as the rest of the converts, in Mendeln something different appeared to have happened. Odyssean could sense none of the same force flowing through his sole remaining sibling as through him. Instead, there was a shadow growing within Mendeln, yet one that Odyssean could not say originated from anything evil. However, neither could say that it had been spawned from anything good. Staring into his brother's penetrating black eyes, Odyssean snarled,
I only understand that he and so many others are dead. But whether it's more my fault or the Triunes, I doubt I'll ever decide.
That was not to what I was referring. But Mendeln got no further. Odyssean shoved past the black-robed figure and resumed his trek into the temple. The others followed at his heels, ever leaving around Odyssean's brother a gap akin to which that they made for their leader. However, in Mendeln's case of late, it was as much out of an unwillingness to be near the sallow figure as it was respect for his place. Even the untouched could detect the oddness in the younger son of Diomedes.
I've shown you the gift,
Odyssean declared to those behind him, while at the same time mentally seeking out hidden dangers ahead.
Remember to use it. It's your life. It's you.
At that moment, he sensed them coming. A chill ran down his spine, and he prayed that his people had listened, or else many more were about to perish terribly. He turned to face the path ahead again. The vast chamber in which they stood was the central gathering place for the faithful before the sermons of the 3 orders began. Towering statues of the Triune's guiding spirits stood watch over the separate entryways leading to where each of the orders met. They were robed, ethereal beings with only vague countenances. Bala on the left with its hammer and a bag containing the seeds of all life. Dialon on the right, bearing at its breast the tablets of order. Mephis in the middle, always Mephis, carrying nothing but cupping its hands as if about to gently receive an innocent baby. A baby to be slaughtered, Odyssean always imagined. And with such an image burning in his mind, he thrust out a warning hand to the rest just as all 3 doors opened and the grotesque, bestial figures in ebony armor came rushing forth. They screamed their bloodlust as they waved their weapons high, and although there were far fewer of them than the invaders, they were no less daunting, especially to Odyssean, who knew of them best. There was that about them that did not speak of mortal flesh anymore, but rather something long overdue for the grave. Odyssean sensed the sudden dismay among his followers and knew that he had to show them that, while sinister, the Morlu were not indestructible. But before he could strike, a brilliant, blinding light flared before his eyes. Letting out a cry, Odyssean staggered into one of those just behind him. Once more, in his concern for the others, he had overestimated himself. He should have expected the priests to have something cunning yet planned in conjunction with this new attack. A pair of hands dragged Odyssean out of the way just as a heavy form collided with his right side. Odyssean spun around, then tumbled to the floor. As he fought to clear his vision, horrific cries rose all around. The terrifying sound of crunching bone sent renewed chills through him. He heard a deep-throated laugh and recognized the demonic voice of a Morlu savoring the carnage he caused. Odyssean had not expected to find any of the Triune's ghoulish servants in Taraja. He had assumed that their kind was for the most part relegated to the vast temple near the capital, and that those who had followed Malik had been exceptions sent out due to the Primus's interest in the son of Diomedes. Now Odyssean wondered if each of the temples had its own contingent, which boded ill. That meant far more Morlu than he could have ever imagined existing. His eyes began to focus. It infuriated Odyssean that for some reason he could not speed up the process. Too slowly, shapes began to coalesce, and one of those shapes, filling his gaze, was a Morlu reaching for him. For his bulk, the armored figure moved astonishingly swift. He seized Odyssean by the collar and dragged his prey up to eye level. Black pits were all that existed physically of the Morlu's eyes, yet Odyssean knew that they saw him better than any mortal orbs. He had witnessed enough during the bitter struggle in Master Ethan's home to understand just how malevolent and powerful were the forces that animated the ebony-helmed fighters.
You are the one,
his assailant grunted, in that voice that could not quite pass for that of anything living.
The one.
Steeling himself, Odyssean concentrated, but again a brilliant light flared before his eyes. Once more, he was completely blinded. The Morlu laughed harder, and then let out a peculiar grunt. He released his hold on the unseeing Odyssean, who just managed to keep from falling and cracking his skull on the floor. Shaking his head, Odyssean focused his every effort on seeing. The world came into focus once more, and there he beheld Cerinthia, a spear gripped tight in her hands, skewering the Morlu as if he wore no armor nor weighed an ounce. The spear blazed silver, and Cerinthia's black hair fluttered as if alive. Her blue eyes, always radiant, now burned with utter determination. Her normally ivory skin was flushed, and her red lips were twisted in grim satisfaction. Odyssean did not doubt that she imagined Achilleos' death as she drove the spear deeper into the twitching, armored figure. She had only just before Achilleos' murder come to love the hunter after years of seeking Odyssean's favor, knowledge that still filled him with shame. One of the very first to accept Odyssean's gift, Cerinthia was now also among the most proficient in drawing it forth. Again, Odyssean knew that much of that ability had to do with her loss, but even he was astonished by her amazing effort now. The Morlu clawed desperately at her, the hungry grin now replaced by something approaching fear. The spear allowed Cerinthia to hold him at bay. She looked anything but the daughter of a country merchant now. Her simple cloth blouse and skirt had given way to the wrapped, colorful dress of a Turagian woman. Indeed, with her long, sleek raven hair, she looked as if she carried some of their blood in her. The dress was designed to flow loose at the legs, and instead of boots, Cerinthia also wore the strapped sandals more common to the people here. The Morlu shook violently, his massive form abruptly beginning to shrivel. Within the space of a breath, he looked even more late for the grave, only his wrinkled white skin now enshrouding his bones. Yet, still Cerinthia kept him impaled. Her expression took on an unsettling eagerness.
Ceri,
Odyssean called, using the childhood version of her name that he had only recently ceased favoring. He feared where her outrage was taking her. His voice cut through the din, and through her fury, Cerinthia glanced back at him, then, with a shiver, the Morlu again. A tear slipped unbidden from her, one that had Achilleos written on it. She tugged on the spear, which slid easily out of her foe. The armored villain dropped like a puppet suddenly bereft of strings, bones and armor scattered across the marble tile. Cerinthia looked at Odyssean with relief and gratitude. He said nothing more to her, only nodding his understanding as he rose to see to the others. As he feared, the trap had claimed more lives. There were bodies strewn about, and although many were Morlu, so too were there Turagians and Parthans. Odyssean saw the slack face of a Parthan woman who had been there on the day when, near the town square, where first he had preached, he had healed a young boy with a malformed arm. That brought bitter memories of the lad and his mother, Bartha, for they had both perished when the townsfolk had come to his defense against Lucian. The boy had been one of the demon's several random victims, and Bartha, stalwart Bartha, had died of a broken heart soon after.
So much blood,
he thought.
So much of it due to me, and their belief in what I bring to them.
But then, silence swept over the chamber, and Odyssean realized that the fighting was again, for the moment, over. The Morlu had not laid waste to the intruders. It was the beasts of Lucian who had been utterly decimated. They had taken lives, too many lives, but not so much as their own numbers. That in itself was a miracle, but far more important, the others had taken up both his and Cerinthia's example. It had not been weapons alone that had brought the Morlu to bay, but the same gift that Odyssean wielded, albeit on a less focused scale. One warrior had been neatly severed in two, the cut so clean at the waist that it looked as if all the Morlu needed was for someone to put him back together to reanimate him. Another lay far above, his corpse dangling limply over Mephis's outstretched hands. Scores more lay scattered about in all sorts of macabre conditions. A striking image that, despite their own losses, Odyssean hoped would bring heart to his surviving companions. Surveying the dead again, Odyssean suddenly choked. The triangular tiles covering the floor were now splattered in black bile, or whatever it was that passed for Morlu blood. But mixed with it was the precious life fluids of those who had either acted too slowly or had hesitated in their trust of their gift. Odyssean mourned each and cursed once more the fact that all his vaunted might could not resurrect them. And that, for reasons he did not understand, made him look again for Mandeln. He found his brother hovering over not their dead comrades, but rather two Morlu who had somehow become twisted around one another. Odyssean's brow arched at this enterprising action and wondered just who among his followers had managed it. Mandeln looked up from whatever it was he was doing. His generally unperturbed expression now took on a darker cast. "This is not over," he announced needlessly. However, it was his next words that most set the elder son of Diomedes on edge. "Odyssean, there are demons here." No sooner had he said it than Odyssean also sensed their nearby presence. The foulness of the Morlu, themselves of demonic make, although of mortal flesh, had masked from him the dire fact. Odyssean also sensed just where they were, and that they awaited him. He had faced other demons beside Lucian, none of them proving as much a threat as the Primus himself. Yet that these new ones waited so patiently, something hard for all but the most cunning of them to do, further stirred his suspicions. They knew of him, knew what he had become. He had only one choice.
"Mandeln, Cerinthia, keep watch on the others. No one is to follow me."
His brother nodded, but the woman frowned.
"We won't let you go alone."
Odyssean stopped her with a glance.
"I don't want another Achilleos. No one follows, especially you two."
"Odyssean."
Mandeln took her arm. "Do not argue with him, Cerinthia. This must be." He said it in such a manner that even his brother paused to look at him. Mandeln offered nothing more, though, as it had become typical of him of late. However enigmatic the statement, Odyssean had already learned to heed such comments.
"No one follows,"
he repeated, staring down everyone.
"or it won't be the wrath of demons you face."
Hoping that they would listen, but still fearing that some, especially Cerinthia, might yet disobey, Odyssean crossed the threshold of the door through which Dialon's followers would have gone. The moment he was clear, the door slammed behind him, just as he knew that so too did the other pair. He had sealed the way, at least temporarily. Even Mandeln and Cerinthia would find it difficult to overcome his effort. So long as he could, Odyssean would keep the path to the underground chambers, the area where worship of the Trione's true masters took place, barred from anyone else. Too many had perished for him already. He sensed the demons nearer, although their exact locations were not known. In truth, They were only a part of the reason that Odyssean wanted only himself at risk. Perhaps that had been what Mendeln had meant, Odyssean suddenly realized. Perhaps, with his own strange abilities, his brother had also detected the more subtle yet distinctive third presence awaiting Odyssean. A presence that was much more powerful than a mere senior priest and known so very well to the both of them. A presence that could only be Lilith.